I see a few more have been able to join, so let's get started with the session, so not to punish the people who are very prompt arrivals. So my name is Martin Kavanagh. I am the head of assessment here at Amberjack. I'm really excited to be talking to you about our the work we've been doing here at Amberjack to build AI era assessments that candidates trust. So I've been with Amberjack, well, as of Saturday, it will be exactly 4 years. And I've been involved in volume assessment for much longer than that, coming up to 20 years now, is where I've dedicated my career to building volume assessment processes that work. And I think it's fair to say and reflect that in the last 3 years, I would say, there's been as much change as I'd seen in the previous 17. So part of what I want to do in this webinar is talk you through the journey we've been on at Amberjack and show you how we're dealing with some of the thorny issues that anyone on this call who is heavily involved in assessment will know that has been a challenging 3 years to deal with some of the context that we've been dealing with. Now, one of the most impactful ways we've had of dealing with the challenges we've had is recruiting Fran Cousins. So absolutely delighted to be joined by Fran on this session, and I will hand over to Fran to introduce herself.
Thank you very much, Martin. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fran Cousins. Recognise quite a few names in the room, so great to be with you. So as Martin said, I am the R&D lead here at Amberjack, and similarly to Martin, I've got a background as an occupational psychologist and spent my whole career working in volume recruitment, both in consultancy and also in in-house roles. And I had actually previously been with Amberjack, and I was lured back because of the really innovative work that's happening in this space. I've been lamenting the lack of kind of really step change progress around what we do around AI. And then when I saw what Amberjack was doing and the approach they were taking, I knew I really wanted to be the one to spearhead that. So alongside my work here, I also work at 4 leading UK universities in the UK as a lecturer and an external examiner. And what that means is that I have to stay really up to date in terms of the latest research evidence. And I can really bring that to bear in terms of what we're doing at Amberjack and making sure that not only are we innovative and at the cutting edge of what's happening, but also that we're totally confident that we've got the academic grounding to do it right.
Great, thank you, Fran. So to give a little bit of a background into Amberjack, this is really quick. For those who aren't familiar with what we do, we help organisations attract, engage, hire and develop talent at scale. So we got some statistics on the slide showing what we mean by that scale. So around 250,000 candidates go through our assessments a year, so really significant volumes. I'm obviously focused on the assessment side of things, but we also do candidate management. So we interact with huge numbers of candidates each year from our delivery team. We do full assessment centre design and management. So you can see around over 3,000 assessment centres managed in a typical year. So we are really focused on dealing with really high volumes. Now, typically that is in the form of early career recruitment, but increasingly we're using our assessments and our techniques in experienced higher areas as well. So to give some structure to what we're going to cover off in this session. So first of all, we're going to give a little bit of a background of assessment in an AI enabled world and some of the background in the context that we've been dealing with. I just want to cover about the journey we've been on and thinking about how well do legacy assessments assess what is needed in the changing and future world of work. I'm going to talk about some of the common techniques organizations are using, particularly around AI avoidance and deterring and detect the inappropriate use of AI in an assessment process, and just cover off why that isn't really a viable solution going forwards. Fran will then start talking about all the work that she's been leading on how do we identify the skills, and particularly the human-led AI skills that are going to set talent apart in the future. And then we're going to talk about, if we understand the skills we want to assess, what is the best way of assessing them given some of the challenges we're seeing in the assessment market currently. So we'll introduce the Amberjack AI skills assessment. And I think throughout my career, I've been very proud to be involved in making assessments that have built on tried and tested methods, improving them, coming up with more immersive ways of assessing. What's really exciting about what we're sharing with you today is we are really at the forefront of what we're doing. So Amberjack are leading the way in building and introducing an AI skills assessment that we think will really change how assessment is managed in the AI era. So we'll share with you the candidate experience. So if you're a talent acquisition person, you can think about, well, what will my candidates actually experience? We'll talk about all the good work that's gone into making and will go into making sure the assessment is fair, valid, and transparent for candidates. We'll talk a little bit, because it's a question we've been getting a lot of, as we've had discussions with early adopters about how it can fit into a volume process. And then another question which keeps coming up: how are we making sure that we're complying with the EU AI Act, and how can we give you, as a potential buyer of this assessment, the confidence that you're going to be using an assessment that is safe? And finally, as I said earlier, we will have the opportunity for any questions and answers that have come up. So let me first of all talk about what's been happening in terms of assessment in an AI-enabled world. And then this is really straightforward timeline. So around the time where I started to talk to Amberjack about potentially joining the team and was excited about the ways in which they were assessing for potential using really immersive types of assessment that gave a really relevant candidate experience, AI was starting to be used in people's individual lives, but typically that was to help them do tasks, low risk tasks, and things that they were happy to mess about with new technology and try out. Then in around summer 2023, particularly with the really rapid adoption of ChatGPT, candidates were more and more starting to think, well, I wonder if generative AI tools can help me with developing CVs and responding to assessment questions and doing video interview responses and various things like that. And then certainly since 2024 to now, we are seeing that candidates are getting quite sophisticated in how they're using AI as it becomes a major part of their day-to-day life. And this is understandable because organizations are increasingly expecting people to use AI. Candidates in their academic careers are being encouraged to use AI. The tools are getting more and more sophisticated, so they're more likely to use it. And also the use of AI is getting very much harder to detect. And you can see there's, this statistic is probably understated now. This is moving on all the time, and you'd have seen some of these statistics in the industry about how candidates are using AI in selection processes. But this statistic showed that 83% of candidates admit they would use AI in interviews if they thought they would not be caught. And increasingly, as AI sophistication improves and the tools get better, it is harder and harder to catch. So more and more candidates are potentially going to be using AI in video interviews, in assessment processes more generally. So there has been a bit of a burning platform to change, but it's not just about how candidates are using AI in assessment process. We at Amberjack believe that legacy assessments no longer assess the correct skills, and there's quite a simple reason for this. So Amberjack, I'm quite proud of how Amberjack have always been really effective at answering this question, and this has given us a really good name in the assessment market. So we have been really effective at identifying the people who will work most effectively in a role for an organization. So we would typically do that by speaking to high performing incumbents, understanding the skills and behaviors needed in a particular role, and assessing for those. So we became really good at that. In the last couple of years, assessing people in that way has begun to creak a little bit. And the reason for that is because the question we should be asking is fundamentally changing. So with people using AI and with the speed at which roles are moving on and work is changing, what is really important is how do we identify the people who will work most effectively when the work changes. So some of the previous methods of job analysis, for example, aren't as effective anymore, because in some ways, does it matter how an effective incumbent is doing the job right now when how they will do the job will look very different in a year to 2 years? So that was a major change that we needed to understand. If you want to know more about how we're thinking about future skills and how we think skills need to be assessed, as part of the follow-up activity, we'll share the sort of thought leadership papers we've done that set out how we've done that piece of work. But there's something else that is also important. So what we're assessing is changing, and how we assess needs to change, because I would say the vast majority of organizations are still talking about, well, how do we avoid the use of AI? How do we deter and detect it? And I just want to call out 3 reasons why this is problematic for organizations. The first one is a major Amberjack assessment principle. So we see assessment as an extension of attraction. We want candidates to say, that was a fantastic assessment experience. If that much care has gone into the assessment, imagine how much care will go into my time in the scheme. Now, picture if you are using an AI avoidance, deter and detect methodology. Often that means a candidate's first experience with you is them saying, we don't want you using AI in the process. If you do, we might kick you out of the process. Here's all the things we're going to do to monitor it and make sure you don't. If I was a candidate, I would think, rightly or wrongly, that means that organization isn't embracing AI. They're not going to be allowing me to use AI to do my job because they don't want me using it in the assessment process. If that same candidate was then completing an assessment process where they were asked to use AI and someone wanted to understand how they engage with AI, I would be thinking that forward-thinking organization, if I join them in a couple of years' time, I'll have a huge competitive advantage over my peers. So deter and detect has a challenge in terms of assessment as an extension of attraction. The methods also don't particularly scale. So even if they are effective, so you hear about providers who are talking about, well, we can spot if someone's eyes are moving to a different place, we can spot if people are toggling between tabs. Those are problematic to scale at the volumes we're seeing in the market at the moment. And also AI is becoming more and more sophisticated all the time. So will they work in the future? So do they scale, and are they future proofed? So what is happening, and a challenge I see in the market, is to deal with this is providers are pushing candidates towards assessments that lack transparency and relevance. And the logic is, well, if it's not clear to the candidates what it is that they're doing and how we're assessing them, how would they use AI to game the system in a certain way? But we know from feedback we're getting and how we speak to candidates that sometimes that lack of transparency and relevance in a lot of roles causes a problem. So an example of this would be what we hear often with sort of more game-based assessments, where, for example, a candidate is assessed for how their tolerance towards risk by asking them, how could you blow up a balloon, and at a certain point, what type do you stop doing that, or do you carry on? That wouldn't be able to be gamed by AI. That is true. But also you get feedback saying, I did this degree, I've got all these academic qualifications, and I'm being told whether or not I can get onto this really high profile, really well paying, really important scheme that I want to be part of based on doing this task, which I don't think has any relevance for the role. So that needed to be addressed as well. So in summary, we had 2 big problem statements here. So legacy assessments no longer assess the skills and behaviors which identify potential in a meaningful way. And AI avoidance through deter and detect is falling behind. So as I mentioned earlier, the solution to these problem statements was recruiting Fran and making this a shared problem with Fran and the rest of the assessment team and the rest of the Amberjack team. So I'm now going to pass over to Fran to talk a little bit about what we've been doing and how we've been making sure we address these problem statements.
Thanks, Martin. So with all of those problems presented, we know that we want to present realistic job previews to candidates and assess them on tasks that actually reflect the types of things that they'll be doing in role. But as Martin said, the challenge of doing that with traditional assessments is that are we really assessing the skills that we think we are, or are we simply assessing how well people can use AI and make it look like they're not? So what we wanted to do at Amberjack was actually say, let's look seriously at what those AI skills that candidates really need now and in the future world of work are, and let's get something really rigorous and robust in place that explicitly measures them. Now, you won't be surprised to hear I wanted to do that in an academic way. So this isn't just us sticking a finger in the air and Amberjack and saying, we think these are the AI skills that are important. We looked at the research evidence, we looked at what the industry was saying, we spoke to our clients, listened to their problems and their pain points around this, and we found 3 key skills in terms of using AI at the moment and that are projected over the next few years that are absolutely crucial. And the first, and I would probably argue the most important, is human-led, responsible AI use. So this is about being aware of when's a great use of AI and when is not. What are the limitations of using AI, and when do you really need to prioritize your judgment as a human being when it matters? Okay, so do candidates know when they should be making the final decisions? Are they making closely looking at interpersonal, ethical, moral issues that really require that context? The next probably will come as no surprise, and that is prompting skills. So can candidates effectively prompt an AI model, iterate and improve prompts to get a really decent output? Now, I don't know about you, but I can think of plenty of times when I was first starting to play with Copilot where I might write 27 prompts, get to a pretty rubbish output and think, do you know what would have been better if I'd just written that myself? Right? That's not a good use of AI. So we want to assess whether candidates can actually prompt a model, get a decent output effectively and efficiently. And the final piece is critical analysis. Now, I talk about this in terms of, can a candidate review, verify, and actually critically evaluate AI output? And also, can they create an output that doesn't scream, this has been written by AI? I call that AI ick. When you read an email and at the bottom it says, now, would you like me to adapt this to be more appropriate for your audience? That sort of stuff. But also, verifying and checking and recognizing AI can make mistakes. AI can get it wrong and AI can hallucinate. So are you confident in the quality of your output? So those are the key AI skills that we know are important to assess. But of course, that is not everything. And we also know at Amberjack, we have our future skills model. And these are the key skills and sub-skills you can see on the screen here that we know to be really important in terms of the future world of work. And our new AI skills assessment, which I'll talk you through now, assesses all of these things. Now, some of these elements on the screen, Martin's already talked about, so things about curiosity, that uniquely human ability to have original vision. Can people deliver? Can people think and communicate really well? And lots of those I'm sure will really resonate with many of you in terms of what's important in your organization. But if you have your own framework of behaviors that are really important for you, either in early careers, volume roles, whatever it is in your organization, we can absolutely assess that too, so it has that flexibility. So it's working really hard, this assessment, in terms of what it can do. We're not only focusing on AI skills. They are important, but they're not everything. Human skill, human capability, human interaction will always be important. We don't want to underplay that either. So what is the assessment, and why did we try and solve these challenges? So as I mentioned, when we were looking at what's already out there in the market, we saw some real gaps in terms of current tools. So many current tools that were trying to look at how candidates interact with AIs would be iterations of existing types of assessment. So things like multiple choice questions, trying to adapt SJT items. We haven't done that. We have started from the ground up and said, no, we're going to design something totally different rather than try and iterate what we've already got, because we're dealing with AI, which is totally different to anything we've dealt with before, right? Where any current tools were using AI, this tended to be more in terms of actually scoring the assessment. So being able to, score candidate responses in terms of things like CV screening, coding tests, those sorts of things, which is helpful. But that is not helpful in terms of how candidates, getting a decent measure of how candidates can actually use AI. So ours, again, is designed from the outset to assess human-led AI capability as well as AI proficiency. Where some other tools were using an element of AI. It may have been about prompting skill or tool familiarity only. So can a candidate use an AI tool at a very basic level? Ours goes much further, as I talked about, in terms of the depth and nuance of the skill that we know are important in terms of human-led AI use. So it's not a test of capability. Can you use this kind of LLM or large language model? It's about much more than that. And as Martin's talked about, many other test providers are leaning away from AI and saying, don't use it. We don't want, we're going to try and deter and detect our way out of it. Whereas we know, and the data shows us that when you combine humans with AI, that is where really amazing performance can happen. Okay. So if we lean into that, then think about the outputs that can be generated for your organization. So let's assess that at the point of bringing candidates in. It makes no sense to me at all to say, don't use AI in any point in the assessment process. Oh, but we do want you to be able to do that well when you get here. How on earth do you know if they're going to be able to do that? So this is built for high volume hiring. As Martin mentioned, Amberjack has a really strong legacy in terms of early careers, but this assessment can work at any role level for any kind of volume and at any stage in the process. And I'll speak to the detail of how that is, because I know lots of you will be thinking, normally that's not how tests go. So we'll talk about the detail of how we've managed to make that work. So what is it and how does it work? I wanted to assess something, as we talked about, that was a really realistic assessment. And I thought, well, what are the best predictors of performance when we look at the data in terms of the types of assessment that really tell us something about how people tend to go on to perform in the role? It's work simulations. It's collecting what I would call primary data. So really getting people to actually do the tasks that you're going to want them to do, rather than just talk about how well they can do that, because that's very coachable, right? That's very trainable. And so what this assessment presents candidates with is a series of very realistic work tasks in the same way that you would when you get to work or you open up your laptop and you get 4 different things at once that you've got to deal with. You've got an email from the partner or the chief technology officer saying, can you take a look at this data set and summarize, actions against these key points and what's important for me? You've got a Teams call coming in from a panicked colleague saying, oh, we've had an escalation from this client. They're really unhappy with this. We need to work out what's gone wrong. You've got a call coming in from a senior client at an organization who's asking you to do something really quite counter to the guidelines that you've been given before. So you need to make a decision about how you're going to deal with it, and so on and so forth. And importantly, to really embed that realism, we are using high-grade, high-fidelity video content, as well as things like, emails and spreadsheets. And we're also giving candidates all of those tasks at once, because lovely though it would be to get an email from your manager, you deal with that task, and then you move on to the next thing. We all know that's not how it goes in the real world of work, is it? And so by presenting them with this, what we do is we get candidates to have a little taste of that role and that industry that they will be in, and also to collect some data about their behavior, how they actually address those different tasks, not just what they say they will. And just some examples shown on the screen here of what that looks like. And also get them to lean in and actually use an AI large language model while they're doing it. And that is the absolutely key differentiator here, is that no one else is currently doing that. So it's, if there is anyone else looking at sort of prompting skills and things like that, they're not leaning into actually iterating and working with a large language model the way that lots of us do day to day. So in terms of candidate flow and how they actually walk through that process, candidates are presented with all of that briefing information, and they can see all of that, go back to it at any time during the assessment. It's always there for them to look at. And then they're given the guidance to write a prompt into a closed large language model that we have just for this assessment, and say, work on the task. Okay, here's some guidelines around the output that we want from you, which is a written output. Here's the headings that you need to use, and answer the question, right? So candidates can use AI for as much or as little as those tasks as they want to. They might say, hey, I think the data set piece is where I want to really lean into that, but I'm going to write the holding email to that really grumpy client myself, I think. Or they might use it to draft all of it and then use various prompts to dive into the detail of it. So it's up to there's many right ways to do this, but it's up to candidates how they approach the task. Again, keeping it realistic as they would in the real world. So they write their first prompt, but before they see the output that's generated, we ask candidates to record a short video interview justifying their approach. So why have you written the prompt in that way? And what are you expecting to see in the output? And that really helps us to get under the skin of the level of understanding they have in terms of the boundaries and the guardrails they need to be putting in place, what AI can and can't do, and whether their expectations of the output are matched broadly with reality. Okay. Then they will see the output and candidates have to go round that loop one more time. So another prompt, which they can use to, for example, look at other elements of the task or to dive into more depth and get more clarity or evaluate the output that they've already got on the existing tasks they've worked on and record that justification video. Then they see the second output, at which point candidates have a decision to make. So they can either take that output and say, yeah, I'm really happy with that, and I'm just going to manually edit that, or they can do a third and final prompt. And again, go around that process before editing that final output. And the reason that we do not allow them to go on indefinitely is firstly that we don't want candidates spending 3 hours on this tool. And secondly, because we're interested in how they are being effective and efficient in the way that they use AI, like I spoke about earlier. So it is leaning into those prompting skills. Then candidates can manually edit that output, that final output, as much as they wish. They could Control A and delete the whole thing if they wanted to and rewrite it from scratch, but we would know if they've done that. So this is looking at, can they review whether AI has done well? Can they edit it? Can they make sure that the tone is correct? All of these sorts of things. And then just before they submit, we ask them 2 final video interview questions. One is really tapping into that human-led AI use. So, which elements of the task did you choose to own yourself and why? And where do you think the limitations of AI might be around those? And then the other is talking about, their critical analysis. So which elements of the output did you verify and check were correct? Did you get the AI to, evaluate its own outputs at all? How did you manually check? And the really cool thing, in my opinion, is that we can check if what they say they have done is what they've done, because we score all of those prompts, all of those video interviews, responses, and not only the final output they submit, but also how it differs to the output that the LLM generated. So it's a super robust way of gathering absolutely tons of data against how the candidate is interacting with AI, and also demonstrating all those additional behaviors that we're really interested in. Now, of course, the way in which we assess candidates is evolving, but the importance of fairness, validity, and transparency in the process will never change. And the first thing I want to say in terms of our assessment principles, our kind of North Star as we've been developing this, is that humans are responsible for AI. I take the design, scoring, and validation of this tool just as seriously, if not more seriously, than any other tool we've designed, because although AI is very clever, it is humans that are responsible for what it does, and we should never mistake AI's autonomy for real human expertise or experience. So, as I've said, the importance of fairness and reliability and validity does not change, and so we have an incredibly robust process in place in terms of making sure that we are validating these tools really well. We have 2 off-the-shelf versions of this tool going live, ready for September, and multiple bespoke versions in build already for existing clients, early adopters, which is really exciting. And they will all go through a really rigorous validation process, including looking at things like, are we confident that we are differentiating between those different skills which we are trying to assess? How difficult is the test? Are we seeing a good range of scores across candidates? Are there any group differences? And if so, how are we going to mitigate against those to make sure that this is fair and equal for all? And so on and so forth. If anyone's got any detailed questions about validation at the end, I'd really welcome them. Be happy to speak to the detail of that, because this is not a black box. We know at Amberjack that by going first and being, really innovating in this space, that it may open lots of questions in terms of how are we using AI, how are we making sure that it's fair, and we want to be really transparent about that, what candidates are being scored on, and how it can feed into your assessment process overall. So I'll move on, but as I say, I really welcome any questions that you might have about that. And as Martin mentioned, of course, this works really well for volume assessment. And I said, you can use it at any stage in your assessment process. So although it looks and feels like a job simulation or like a role play and a kind of critical analysis task that you might see in an assessment centre, it is behaving like a psychometric tool, and it is a psychometric tool for all intents and purposes. So what that means is that we can use it very effectively for volume sifting early on in the process, and indeed many of our early adopter clients are using it at that stage. It's the first thing that candidates will do. But that's not the only place where it can be used. We also have lots of interest in people using it at assessment centre, again because it is so high fidelity, it would fit really seamlessly into a suite of assessment centre tools. Many clients thinking about, do we want to, maybe we don't necessarily always need to assess for this at the point of selection, but we certainly want to take a baseline measure of where our new starters skill level lies in terms of AI and these other skills. So we're going to use it in onboarding and as a development tool. So it's got that great flexibility that it can sit anywhere in your assessment process. And I just wanted to share some examples of some of our early adopter clients on the slide in terms of industry. So things like law and also for technical and IT roles, we have some initial off-the-shelf tools being launched, but also it would lend itself really well to things like logistics, to things like sales, customer services, and many more. So really, any type of role where there is some interaction with AI, and let's be honest, that is increasingly all roles, this works really well for, because we are leaning into this realistic job preview in the assessment content that can look like however you want it to. So I've said, that we can assess at any industry, but that also means that we can assess at any higher level. So although some of our clients are looking at this in terms of early careers, we also have lots of clients exploring the idea of what this might look like in terms of more senior roles and experienced hires as well, because these types of skills are not unique to being things that are required at early career only. And of course, because we can swap in any additional behavioural frameworks that you like, if you're looking at your more senior hires and you're thinking, we want those AI skills and we want other skills from them particularly, we can assess that with this tool really confidently. And as I said, we have the off-the-shelf versions, we have fully bespoke versions, and you can basically have anywhere in between. So there's some great flexibility and adaptability with this tool, which makes it really scalable across roles and departments. I wanted to finish by touching briefly on everyone's favourite topic when we talk about AI, which is the EU AI Compliance Act. And we are obviously very keen to ensure that we are meeting the requirements of this act. To do that, we are building compliance into the design. We are not trying to retrofit the assessment to comply once it is designed. So I have conversations about this on a daily basis. And as I've said before, I can go into more detail on all of the points on the slide at the end if anyone has any specific questions. But to reaffirm our commitment to this, we are engaging with an external consultancy, who specialise in AI assessment auditing with occupational psychology expertise. And they are working with us through as we validate scoring to ensure that that is a really rigorous approach from the ground up as we validate the tool. And we'll also be seeking independent legal advice to sign off the assessment before use. So this is front and centre in our minds, and we know that our clients will want to be reassured by this. So we build that in the way that we do everything. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand back to Martin at this stage, as I know that he has a few questions, I believe, to put me on the spot with this. So over to you, Martin. Please be kind.
Sorry, it's on mute. That is right. I have got some questions to put Fran on the spot. So we're going to open up to wider question and answers, but I just wanted to bring people into the world that Fran's been living in since joining Amberjack, and some of the questions I've thrown at her. And then, as I said, unhelpfully made some of the sort of more thorny issues with designing this assessment Fran's problem, and made sure she's thinking of the right solutions to this. So just because I've been always impressed with the care that Fran's putting into the thought behind these, I just wanted to show you some examples of some of the more complicated issues that Fran's been able to reassure me on. So the first one is around, how do we make sure we don't favour people who have access to paid AI tools?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that AI skills are like any other skill in that they can be developed, right? So what that means in practice is that just as someone who has faced more adversity and challenges in their life might show greater personal resilience, so someone who has had more chance to practice using AI might be able to demonstrate some of those AI skills more readily. So we know that, and the way in which we are ensuring equity and fairness for all candidates is to be really transparent in our communications about what the assessment is going to include, what types of skills they'll need to demonstrate, and how they can practice using them using freely available open AI tools to develop these skills. With all assessments, whether it's an SJT, an interview, anything, we know that there can be practice effects. That's not specific to AI-enabled tools. But what that means is that we are encouraging candidates to practice prompting skills, critically reviewing outputs, and so on, through some really targeted, clear communication. And we are providing practice materials for candidates to do that and to level the playing field. So on the development roadmap for sort of version 2, we also have a practice test within our own LLM on that platform for candidates to play around with the system as well. The benefit of this assessment is that everyone is using the same large language model, so the same AI tool to complete the assessment. So there's going to be no benefit to candidates who have the resources to access paid for models over open AI models because everyone's using the same one. That benefit does exist in other assessment types where candidates are cheating by using AI to answer the questions, because the chances are that, premium Copilot, for example, might do a better job of it than the open Copilot, but that issue is removed in this assessment. I've talked for a long time, but the last thing I also want to say in answer to that question is that in the validation process, we will be taking a measure of how often and how frequently people are using AI tools and what types of tools they're using, and seeing if we are seeing any patterns in terms of performance on the task overall, to be sure that this is really meaningfully predicting something about how people are going to perform in the role. So we have thought carefully about that.
Great. I'm annoyed with myself that I gave Fran a preview of the next question to give her a bit of a head start. But given the complexity of the scoring and the importance of adhering to the EU AI Act, how do we manage human in the loop scoring for the AI scored elements?
Yeah, so having humans be able to make final decisions to override is absolutely crucial. In answer to that question in full, I want to note the difference, I guess, between kind of auto-scored elements of the assessment. So this is quantitative stuff. So, for example, is the word count under the specified word count, versus what the AI scores, which is the qualitative stuff. So anything that would otherwise be human judgment. So is the tone appropriate for the audience? So the auto-scored elements are kind of one section of it. We can put that to one side. But the LLM or the AI scored elements, if a candidate requests additional human review of their scores as per the EU AI Act, we can accommodate this. So human in the loop on AI scored elements means that someone can go in, they can do a thorough QA of scores, and that human reviewer has the authority to override or ignore the AI results completely. We are not in any way beholden to what the AI has decided. Right? We also have built-in flags that will send a candidate's assessment automatically to human review. So for example, that might look like setting a confidence level for the AI, so the AI can say, I'm only 97% sure that I've scored this correctly. Can I have a human review? And that will be set at that incredibly stringent level. We're going to require the AI to have only 3% doubt that it's not totally right before we check it. So that will be, in the process to make sure that humans in the early stages will be very heavily involved and will be involved throughout. At no point would we ever just let the AI run the scoring and leave it to its own devices.
Thank you. And then this is something that's really important to us. So one of the issues that any of our existing clients of sort of our more legacy assessments will know that one of the challenges we've had is that actually we build a fantastic assessment, very immersive, looks and feels great, gives the candidate the experience we want them to have. But if they want a slightly different version, we in effect need to build a whole new assessment. So how are we making sure that we've got what we call sort of scalable bespoking?
Yeah, this was a real head scratcher because, yeah, similarly, I've faced that pain for many years in terms of SJTs and other things. But there's actually a number of ways that we could do this really well with this assessment, and they're all grounded in the fact that the testing of the scoring rubric is so robust. The validation of that before we set this live out into the world is going to be so extensive. So what we can do is adapt the candidate-facing content, so what I would almost call the wraparound, from either the off-the-shelf versions to be industry and role level specific, or if we have a client that has their own adapted or bespoke version, we can then work with that, right? To turn that into multiple different versions, so we can iterate from that. So what that means is that the candidate is seeing very high fidelity, very realistic tasks and challenges that are very much representative of the types of stuff they're going to be doing in role. But actually there's fairly minimal changes to the underlying scoring mechanism. We don't have to fully revalidate, go through that really lengthy process every time. Any edits would of course be rigorously tested and there would be some validation, but we wouldn't be starting from scratch the way that you are with every other assessment method, right? So that keeps the design costs fundamentally much lower than, for example, a bespoke SJT or similar, and so we can roll that out and adapt at scale pretty promptly.
Great, thank you, Fran. And then finally, how do we make sure this works for all volume hiring and not just early careers?
Yeah, and the answer to that is because it's a work simulation. It's not just a set of scenarios or tell me about a time when. So I talked at the sort of beginning about how the data shows us that work simulations give us really high quality data about how candidates actually do the job, not just what they say they're going to do. And that is true at any role level. So as I said, that candidate briefing content can be adapted however needed to suit any volume role. And also we can adapt the level from a scoring viewpoint. So some behaviours and skills are likely to remain exactly the same, right, regardless of the role level, because this is what it means to be a human in the workplace and to do well. But we can also obviously adapt those skills that we are assessing, and we can also increase the requirements for the pass mark to be higher. If you're saying, actually, do you know what, we know that the skills we need are the same across the organisation, but when we're looking at volume roles that aren't entry level, we need them to be at that higher level. Fine, we just adapt the benchmark, obviously validating and making sure we're not seeing any adverse impact around that, but we can do that in a really straightforward way. So it's, our initial off-the-shelf versions of this tool have been designed for the early careers market, but it's total flexibility in terms of what that can look like.
Great. Okay. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to open up to any other questions that have come in, and also any that are coming in through the Q&A. Just as we're answering those, I'll just hand over to Richard to sort of talk through what questions we've received. But what you've got on the slide in front of you is a QR code. So if you'd like to book a demo of the assessment and talk a little bit more about your specific context, you can do that. I'll leave that up for a little bit as we start to pick up the questions that you're sending through to us. So Richard, anything coming through?
Yeah, we've got a question from Phil, which you may have touched on slightly, but should we assess AI skills at selection stage or focus on providing relevant AI training in role?
Yeah, thank you. And I can see Phil has actually followed up with saying, I think you've just answered that question, but just to reiterate, I would argue both, but if it's something that you need people to be able to do in your organisation, ideally from day one, which is increasingly the case, then why on earth would you not assess for it at the point of selection? The earlier that you can get a decent measure of that skill and know where the development points might be, the better that person's going to be able to hit the ground running when they get in.
And to add to that, I suppose that's partly why we're making sure it is assessing the future skills model. So behaviorally, it's assessing the things that you want to be getting using AI and the LLM as a way of assessing those and seeing how you can look at those. And I suppose this is where that point I made around assessment as an extension of attraction becomes really key, because actually, as well as getting robust data, you want to be showing candidates that they get an opportunity in role to work with AI. So using this up front will be a real differentiator and give a real competitive advantage.
Cool. The next question from Priya is, with the example flow that you showed, what are the estimated average candidate completion times, just conscious on the demands on a candidate's time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Nice to see you on, Priya. Yeah, exactly that. I've been thinking really carefully about how we balance gathering all this really rich data, this really rich primary data, getting candidates to do all these things, assess all these skills, and also not have them sat there for 5 hours, you know, trying to do this, because we want it to be something that works really well up front. So, and actually the first iterations I did, Paul Martin sat through one, I think it took him about 2 hours, and we realized, okay, we've got to scale this back. So we're anticipating that it will take candidates about an hour. We have consciously made the decision not to make it time limited, because we know that that can have a negative impact on candidates from different groups, and we want this to be as open and accessible as possible. We do encourage candidates to do it in one sitting, and not to leave it sort of indefinitely, but they are able to take breaks and things like that. So we estimate about an hour. Again, that is something that's going to be really carefully checked in terms of validation, and also just to augment, I guess, preempt maybe an additional question to that, is that we're going to be very carefully checking that, although we're not specifying a time limit, that we're not seeing a big increase in scores as candidates take longer. So we have the ability, this is all configurable, right? We have the ability to limit that slightly, or to reduce the level of content that candidates need to produce or work with. So there's loads of flex in there, but the short answer, I suppose, is about an hour.
Cool. Do feel free to pop any more questions you might have in the Q&A panel. You can find it at the top of your screen. I believe we have one from, I'll start with Shannon's one. What does the scoring look like, and how is it shown to the firm/client to help any decision making if they use it in that way?
So the scoring rubric looks very similar to the type of scoring rubric you might see for a behaviourally anchored interview question or a assessment centre exercise, in that it has a series of behaviours. Now, because we don't want the large language model just going totally rogue, we don't let it to just make a judgment between 1 to 5 the way that a human might do, right, on how much of that behaviour a candidate has demonstrated. It's much more black and white, so it's yes or no, has the candidate demonstrated that? As a result, as you can imagine, those scoring rubrics are huge. So they're absolutely enormous, because we need to be really confident that we are pinning down the LLM, and that it can't hallucinate or make decisions and judgments that we don't want it to do. Of course, when we're working with the client in terms of validating the assessment or adapting it for their own organisation, then they will be able to see and have input into that. Shannon, I'm not sure if you are referring to kind of whether the firm or the client want to manually score the assessment themselves and have that override, or, you know, so if we, for QAing, we'll have a slightly different approach. Otherwise, it will just take, you know, an hour to score per candidate, which is not sustainable. So if it's helpful, I can speak to the detail of that, although I'm not quite sure what you're asking. But also longer term, in sort of future iterations, we are looking at the possibility of candidates doing the task in exactly the same way, but actually being able to just have human scoring rather than AI scoring behind the scenes for any clients that prefer to use it in that way.
Great. Next question from Robert. Can candidates use paid OpenAI alongside the AI tool to answer the questions? For example, write me an effective professional prompt to deliver X, Y, or Z.
So if they do that, we will know that they've done it, because if they, well, I guess the first thing is, why would they do that? Because we can see, right, what the output would be from the LLM that they're using based on the prompt that they've written. So if they were to do this whole exercise, but let's say in an external tool, the output that they generate will not match what should have been generated. So that would be a really easy cheating flag for us to say, you know, throw up that this candidate is doing something iffy. And we can also, of course, there's proctoring in place to do things like recognize if there's other tabs open and what those tabs are and these sorts of things. So really there'd be no benefit to the candidate to do it. And if they did, they would be flagged as cheating. So no, I guess is the short answer.
And to Fran's point earlier, I've piloted the very early version, so back probably mid-March kind of time, and when I went through it, I was thinking about using a premium version, and to that point I was like, well, hang on, what is this going to achieve? This simply won't add anything and won't work, and will just eat up my time. So a fairly emphatic answer to that is no, they wouldn't. It would make no sense to do, and if they did, they would perform poorly on the assessment. And I think definitely worth booking in a demo with us so we could take you through it, so you can see exactly the logic behind that, so you can understand that point. But yes, no, it wouldn't benefit from that.
Thanks, Martin.
Great. Time for a couple
Looks like that might
more
be
questions.
it for questions for now, I think. Yeah.
Okay. So if I just wrap up with a big thank you. Hopefully everyone had lots of time to get the access to the code to book on to follow-up sessions with us. Big thank you from myself and Fran for joining us. Worth plugging an upcoming webinar, which you'll also receive in a follow-up activity, which is our next webinar on the 3rd of June, which is looking at the evolving candidate experience and how we're making sure we get the best out of that at Amberjack. So thank you very much everyone for joining. Follow-up materials will be sent. You've got a way of booking a demo of us. Please do. Let's carry on the conversation. Let's carry on throwing tricky questions at Fran to make sure we have the very best tool ready to launch properly in September, ready for early career season. Thank you everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.